Hi, I'm Princess Senate, conference producer at Technology Networks, and I am here to introduce our final talk of the day, Strategies for Successful Laboratories, Establishment, and Transition. I am pleased to welcome our speaker, Aaron Baer. Aaron ca- completely Aaron completed his degree in genetics and genomics at UC Davis with a focus on gene expression in C. elegans. Aaron is currently a senior implementation lead at QBench, and prior to joining, he was a sequencing project manager for Novogene. In his time as both an academic and private researcher, Aaron had the opportunity to learn about several methods and strategies for streamlining practices in a laboratory setting. A warm welcome to you, Aaron. Following the presentation, we will have a Q&A session and we welcome any questions that you may have. Please ask questions using the Q&A system to the right-hand side of the video player. You can also use this feature to connect with attendees and discuss the talk, so feel free to take advantage of the chat system by introducing yourself and sharing your thoughts during Aaron's presentation. You can also benefit from some fantastic supporting literature, which you can download for free below the video player. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please request help using the technical help icon in the menu on the left-hand side of the player. And with that out of the way, I will now hand over to Aaron to begin his presentation.
Thank you, Princess, for that introduction. So, as Princess stated, my name is Aaron Baer, and I'll be talking about some strategies for successful laboratory establishment and transition. So we'll go ahead and dive right in. So first, I just have a quick table of contents. So I'll be going over a little bit of my background and then getting into three main topics that I have for how to set up a lab successfully. So the three topics that we'll be covering are personnel, hardware and software, and workflow and accreditation. So first, I wanted to just start off by introducing myself. So as I said before, my name is Aaron Baer, and my title actually just recently changed. I've got a little bit of a promotion. I'm now titled as a Senior Technical Account Manager at QBench, and I've been working there for about 3 years. And in that time, I've had the opportunity to work with more than 50 different labs in various testing industries and help them set up their workflows and begin implementing their testing system. So a little bit more about my background. So my undergrad education is in genetics and genomics at UC Davis. So I graduated in 2016. And then following that, I took a year off and then went back to school to continue learning more about genetics and genomics in a master's program. And that's where I wrote my thesis on gene expression in C. elegans. And it really got me interested in moving into the biotech industry and learning more about the sequencing process and new practices. So that led me to my first position as a project manager at Novogene following my graduation. I worked there and managed about 200 projects and sequencing projects during my year that I was at the company. And I had the opportunity to work with a lot of research institutions as well. I found a new opportunity as a technical account manager at QBench. So I started in 2020 and I'm still working there now. And as I said, I've conducted more than 50 implementations across a number of industries, such as material testing, analytical chemistry, diagnostic testing, clinical testing, and a variety of other industries. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right into my talk for today. So some keys to success when establishing a new lab. So I wanted to break this into three primary categories that are going to be very important as you're going through and thinking about how to set up your testing workflow and how to get started receiving samples from your customers. So I'll be starting off by talking about personnel. This will include things like who to hire, how to go over training, and how to prepare for inevitable turnover or transitions within your company. Following that, we'll go ahead and dive into hardware and software. This is going to be the real meat of our discussion as we talk about how to get a location, when to line that up, different instruments and tools that you'll want to leverage as you're conducting your workflow, as well as LIMS data management and integration with your tools and instruments. We'll finish up with some more technical items with workflow and accreditation. This will cover things like the lab's day-to-day processes, knowing your workflow and accounting for any edge use cases, and then how to deal with getting validation, certification, dealing with audits and accreditation. So lots of useful information there on how to get things up and running from a more bureaucratic side of the process. So we'll start off with personnel. So we're going to be talking about how to best build your team today. And so I broke that out into three primary roles. Obviously, there's a number of different roles that you can have depending on the throughput of your lab and the size of your team. But the way that I like to break it down is into three primary categories. So we have the technician, who is going to be sort of the front line of the lab, and they're going to have the hands-on experience of working with the samples and making sure that things are running smoothly. The managerial side of the workforce will be making sure that everyone knows what they're doing and that the workflow is moving smoothly from step to step. And then lastly, we'll have quality management, which is just making sure that we have all of our certifications accounted for and any sort of quality metrics being measured properly. So we'll start off with our technician role. So my recommendation is when you're looking at hiring technicians, you'll want to look towards more recent graduates or even looking for interns, because that gives you an opportunity to engage with individuals that are still learning about new practices within that field. And so that's really helpful because it gives you an opportunity to hear feedback from those individuals, but also let them get the experience that they haven't necessarily acquired since they've been focused on learning about those newer techniques. So it's a sort of a two-edged benefit where you can help the individual develop their own skills, allowing for personal career development, but also really help to train up your internal team members. Another aside that I like to mention here is the accessioning portion of the workflow. So as you have higher volumes within your lab, you may need to break out the process of just logging samples in to another team within the organization. And so this can be a more high stress role than a lot of other positions because it's sort of the very front lines where all of the samples are coming in. And if it's high volume, it can get a little bit stressful if there's a lot of samples to deal with. So it's important to take that into consideration when you're looking to build out your team members. On the side of managers, obviously previous lab experience is going to be imperative, but it doesn't necessarily need to be within the same field. So I want to mention that just with a caveat saying that if you do have an individual who has spent several decades within the field of analytical chemistry and you want to move them into diagnostics, it might be a little bit of an adjustment, but that previous lab experience is going to be very invaluable. Additionally, I also wanted to point out that even if you have a more novel workflow, it may not be possible to find a manager that has experience in your field. And so in those cases, you'll want to be looking for individuals that have relevant leadership experience, but are also able to be flexible and learn new skills. You can think of this individual as a problem solver and a mentor to the rest of the team. And then lastly, I wanted to get into talking about our quality control position. So the QA team is going to make sure that certifications are being met and that the lab is doing what it's supposed to be doing from a technical point of view. And so the best way to do this is by quality control testing, which means making sure that runs within the lab or days within the lab are consistent and that you're getting consistent results. And so you're definitely going to want to have an expert on your particular process. So if you have an ASTM or an ISO requirement, depending on your testing workflow, you'll want to have an individual in this role who has familiarity with those types of requirements. So that way you're able to be better equipped when you have to deal with any strange edge use cases or audits or things like that. This role also often requires the most technical familiarity. And so for this, you will want to look for individuals that have either experience within your same field or within a very closely related field that has relevance to what you're looking at. It also helps to promote internally for this role if possible. So if you already have an established workflow and you're looking for somebody who can manage the quality control pipeline, it's very helpful to have somebody on your team that has that experience or that has the drive to learn that new subject matter. So it's really important that when you think about building and training your team, you're considering these three different roles, but obviously you can break the team out into a much larger number of individuals as well. So this next slide that I have here just shows a breakout of, and obviously from business to business, it's going to vary what roles you have on the team depending on throughput, size of the team, and your own personal goals with the team. But this is just an example of how you could potentially break out 8 different roles for your staff and then train them on particular functions. So obviously administrators are going to need to be familiar with every step of the workflow, but you can have other individuals that are less familiar with certain steps if they're not involved with billing or QMS or things like interacting with the customers through a customer portal. So I just like to bring in this graphic just to represent how diverse the team can be and how it's important to think about which responsibilities align with which team member and looking at how to best draw from your previous experience to inform your current team members. Next, I wanted to move into a little bit more of my recommendations for how to train your team. So there's 2 really important keys that I like to get across. The first is consistency. Having a consistent work plan for training will make it so that way you can have a more repeatable process, and it gives your team members reference on how to do things within the lab if they're not familiar with a certain practice. Additionally, it also allows you to establish SOP documents. That way you can have a documented process in the lab that can be referenced by the team members. Another important point of this is that consistency will inspire confidence. If your team sees things being done consistently or done in the same way over a course of time, they'll be more comfortable or more confident in the decisions that they make based on what they've seen. So it's important to have this grounding for your team, so that way they are able to best do their jobs without being worried about making mistakes or edge use cases. Another really important focus of this is to keep things light. When you're training, it can get very dry. You can have a really long set of documentation. Oftentimes training can just be a number of videos or documents that need to be reviewed and read, which can be very difficult to get through without getting distracted, or just very difficult to hold your attention. And so my recommendation is to have breaks within that training process, keep things light, and encourage discussion between different team members to help them discuss, ways that they think maybe things could be done differently, or that way they can best communicate on what they've seen be successful practices within the lab. So keep things consistent, keep things light. And then my last item here is just feedback is a gift. That point of discussion about keeping it light really helps you hear the feedback from your team members and help deal with any sort of edge use cases or unusual circumstances. So now that we've talked about training our team, I wanted to get into turnover and transitions. So in the field of science or the greater field of the testing, there's a lot of individuals that are motivated to grow their careers and develop their skills. And this leads to those individuals either moving into higher positions within the same company or looking for other opportunities. And so this causes a little bit of a complication for leadership at the lab, because retraining and replacing is a costly endeavor that requires quite a bit of additional resources, and it takes time away from your core workflow in the lab. So when thinking about these things, it's vital to the longevity of the lab to prepare for these situations. And the best way to do that is to keep the whole team involved in the workflow. So I'm going to step back for just a moment to my training slide here. And you'll notice that the top row, the intro, the happy path, which is meant to be sort of the core of your workflow, is something that's noted for each member of the team. And the reason for that is because if every member of the team has a little bit of knowledge, then they can help fill in new hires or new individuals that are becoming acquainted with the lab's processes. So another thing that's also useful there is documented SOPs for transitions and making sure that you've inspired that discussion among your team members so that way they can feel comfortable helping one another. Then a couple of other points that I have here for helping to prevent your team from being drained by transitions or turnovers is these 4 points. So the first is always be growing the team. Obviously, if business isn't doing well, that's going to be a little bit more challenging, but keep an eye on your sample volume. And as it's increasing, think about where you'll need to make milestones for adding new team members, just that way you can support that large flow of incoming samples. The next item here is focusing on the big picture. So thinking about your workflow or what your lab does in the big picture is really helpful for keeping track of that process. And it also helps the rest of the team understand what the end-to-end workflow looks like. So this goes back to the idea of making sure that everyone has a good general understanding of the process, and that falls into that big picture purview. Additionally, it's very helpful when possible to promote internally. This allows you to reduce required resources for training new team members and getting them up to that baseline level of knowledge. And it also encourages your team members to work hard to develop their goals so that way they can grow within the company themselves. And then the last point that I wanted to touch on here is just ideal qualities. So one thing that's talked about very often in business is an ideal customer profile, or an ICP. And so one thing that I like to sort of build off of that idea with is an ideal employee profile. Think about what qualities would really make that employee shine in the position and succeed with their goals. You don't want to put somebody in a position where they're not going to be matched for what's required of them. And so you can always think about the ideal qualities, the ideal profile of those new employees. So these cover the first section on personnel. So I wanted to just review really quickly on a couple of key items. So the first being who to hire. So hire people with experience in the field. Think about individuals that are going to be flexible, able to learn new skills and ideas, but you also want to have experts or individuals that are more familiar for those more technical roles like the manager or the quality control role. Moving into training, you want to be consistent and know your workflow. So we'll be talking about this a lot more later in the talk, but it's a really important part of training because it helps the rest of the team be familiar with what's going on in the lab. And lastly, handling turnover and transitions, have your replacement plan in place. And I'm going to say this a lot, but it's all about the workflow. The better understanding everyone has about the workflow end to end, the easier it's going to be to help get new hires up to speed and get everyone on the same page. So now that we've had a chance to talk about who to build onto your team, we're going to talk about some of the hardware and software that you're going to fill your lab with. So this is where we're getting into some more technical decisions, purchasing options and things like that. So we'll start out with hardware. So we're going to talk about getting your lab location and when to do that. We'll talk about instruments and how to find the right instrument for your purposes. We'll go over inventory management. You've got a lot of things that are required for testing, so you want to have a good way to keep track of them. And then on the software side of things, we'll be talking about how to manage your data. So the most common way to do that is through a LIMS. And then we'll also be getting into integrations or how to connect your instruments with your data management system. So we'll dive right on in. So getting a location. This is one of the most important steps when you're setting up a lab because you can't perform your testing without an actual brick and mortar location. And it may seem like an unlikely issue, but it's surprisingly common that some labs will get ahead of themselves in the process, and you may start going through and hiring individuals and building out your workflow before you actually even have a brick and mortar location lined up. So my recommendation is always think about where it is that you're going to have your location before you even start making those decisions about purchasing and hiring, and then figure out what it's going to take to get to that location. Because it's imperative that the lab has that physical location for you to have an address for samples to be sent to for testing. And it also may be very enticing to jump the gun and have a sooner launch date by getting things set up and trying to hire sooner, but it can also be a drain on your resources as well. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're planning out getting a location relative to when you have your workflow organized. The next item that I have here is on our instruments and tools. So we're going to talk about two main categories here. The first being the right tool for the job. So when we're talking about doing various types of testing in the lab, you can have analytical chemistry testing, and you can have various instruments that are related to that. But the idea is that most of the time you're going to need some sort of equipment that's going to be able to record that data. And so the best way to find the right instrument that fits your needs is to think about first the throughput of your lab. Is that instrument going to be able to support the number of samples that you want to run on that machine? And you'll also want to understand the limitations of the equipment that you're purchasing. So the older that an instrument is, the less likely it is that it'll be able to interface directly with some sort of cloud-based or separate management entity. And you'll also have to convert that data sometimes into a more usable format. So it's important to think about that when you're selecting your instruments, and just make sure that you have a good understanding of from the vendor of what your instrument can provide for you. Now, once we've run our samples, we're going to have data that we need to either process or provide to our customers. And so it's really important that you know how to best handle the data coming off of your instrument. So you'll want to first ask yourself if you can modify the data that comes off of this instrument, if you're going to need to, and then how to move it around. So I have just an image here with a bunch of different file formats just to get people thinking about, a lot of times we'll see that Excel or CSV is a really common file format, but it's very possible that an instrument that you have might give you a very unique proprietary form file that you'll need to convert. So you'll want to be wary of older instruments that may be harder to interface with, even though they may be a little bit more cost effective when setting up the lab. And then one last item for knowing how to handle your data is to have a team member that's familiar with that type of data. Obviously, this goes back to hiring the correct managers and quality assurance individuals, but you just want to make sure that when you're getting to that data management step, that individual is well versed in how to process or manipulate that particular file. So I wanted to take a break here from my discussion to just talk about some integration troubles that I've seen during my time working with various labs and implementing LIMS software. So a really common issue is that when we're talking about integrations with an instrument, this could mean that there's an instrument in the lab that's been around for multiple years and has always been sort of a core to the workflow. And so at one point there may have been an expert on that instrument, but they also may have left the team. And so there have been cases where we've seen labs end up paying millions of dollars for instrument integrations because they don't have the internal support on how that instrument works. And in other cases, we've seen that support from the vendor side of things can be non-existent. So it's really important to think about what can go wrong when you're integrating an instrument with your system, and also think about the payout for it, if it's going to be worth it at the end of the day, if you're going to be able to recoup the losses and get the return on your investment. So I just wanted to take a break here to mention that before we proceed on to our next slide. So we're going to start talking about inventory management. So testing often requires materials. Materials need to be managed so that you can make sure that you have a good idea of your cost per run and optimizing your throughput. And so the way that you can do this is using various inventory management tools. So there is entire software built around managing your inventory, as well as certain limbs that have it built into their structure. So it's really important to think about what scale you're going to need for your inventory management, if you need a dedicated tool, or if it's something that could be tracked as simply as an Excel sheet. When you're thinking about what tool is the right one for you, it's also important to think about how you're going to be restocking your supply. When you run out of the reagent, how you're going to be refilling it, and then tracking expiration dates as well. It's very common that you'll have a lot of different buffers, and some of them may be usable for a certain duration after expiration, others may not be. And so an inventory tracking system helps you manage that process. And then the last option is just sort of thinking about resource management by method. So if you have multiple methods in lab that you're testing for, you have workflows for various types of materials, or you have workflows that test for different pathogens, you can think about what resources are required for each of those lines of business, and then sort of key those in as a by method resource management or resource group. So just some key things to look at when you're thinking about inventory management. But now I want to move into more of the software side of things. So we're going to go ahead and start off by talking about our limbs, or how to manage our data. So testing data has to go somewhere once it's been produced by the instrument. And there's a couple of different ways that you can manage it. So first, I want to talk about some potential issues. So if you're going to go with a more manual process, so we'll start here on the left and we'll work our way over. So Excel is going to be our most manual data management process. You can just take those files and load them into an Excel sheet and then add your formulas, perform logic and things like that. But it's going to be difficult to handle transcription errors, and you're not going to really have an automatic backup for saving those Excel files independent of that instrument. And there's also not too much of a way to connect data from different stages of the workflow, unless you're able to make some of your own connections or make some software that's able to interact and act as a middleware. And so that's what gets me into this middle option here for the homemade data management. If you have some team members that are a little bit more computer science savvy, they might be able to write some middleware that's able, or write some scripts that'll be able to process the data and move it to the correct location. And so this can be a very common and low cost way to set up your data management, but it does require you to have that in-house resource to be able to configure. The last option, and probably the most expensive, would be for a LIMS provider. So a LIMS will provide an easy solution to the problem of transcription errors, because it'll give you a system that's in general going to be backed up and have an audit trail, so that way you can see when that data crossed in and compare it to the original. It's also going to give you ways to automatically back up your data. So thinking about these kinds of benefits is what makes a LIMS a very good option for most labs when they're dealing with higher volumes. Another item that I wanted to touch on is the idea of freedom and flexibility between LIMS providers. So when we're talking about different LIMS, they have different degrees of configurability versus customizability. So if you think of configurability as settings that you can change in the system, you can modify your screen's brightness, you can turn the volume up and down. Those are configurable settings. Customizable options would be if you need to make a core change to your instrument, like one of those homemade middlewares that I was talking about earlier. And so when you're looking at different LIMS providers, you really want to lean more towards the configurable options, so that way you can make changes internally. This allows the lab to be more independent and more flexible as workflows change, and allow you to update things at lower cost to yourself. It's never helpful to have to reach out to your vendor to have a custom change made that you have to go through the process of scoping, and then you have to pay for that particular feature. It's much easier to just configure your system to be able to better handle your workflow. I also want to mention that a LIMS provider would be for a more growth-oriented lab. So the more that you're trying to expand your business, the more you're going to want to have the gaps in your system covered by an efficient provider. So that's where a LIMS can really be critical for your workflow. But at the same time, another way to think about this is that the LIMS provider cost is going to be much lower than the yearly overhead. Comparing a LIMS provider to like a mass spec instrument or a state-of-the-art CBC chem instrument, is going to be on orders of magnitude. It's going to be much cheaper to get your limbs in place than it would be to buy a dozen instruments for your lab. So it's just important to think about the cost benefit for a limbs because that is one of the lower price points, but there are also ways to handle it internally. So building on that idea of limbs flexibility, I wanted to talk about a couple of different flexibility points. So the first being configuration. So we talked about this a little bit before, but this could be as far as configuring the system to show different fields that gather information for your specific workflow and that allow you to rename objects in the system. So you want to think about all the different things that you may want to change when you're looking at a limbs demonstration. So that way you can determine if those are configurable options or if you're going to have to go a more custom route to get that changed. So you want to think, again, it goes back to that freedom to configure independently and thinking about the time to update with a more rigid system that requires custom development as opposed to configurability. The next item in flexibility that I have here is templates. So there are limbs providers available that allow you to configure your own templates for reporting, for data management, and all sorts of other steps in your workflow process. And so again, this is where you come back to that customizable versus configurable option, where if you're able to build those templates yourself or one of your team members is able to do that, you'll be able to save a lot of time and resources and not have to worry about reaching out to your vendor for help. The same is true for the API. You know, if you have those resources that we talked about previously, building middleware within the lab or building out scripts for managing data, you can also have them access the API of your limbs if it's a cloud-based application. And that'll allow you to have a direct connection and facilitate data transfer. So again, it's important to think about these different points of flexibility. And then the last one is the location of your limbs. So this one's a little bit difficult to grasp at first, but this is essentially how your limbs exist within the space of your lab. And so there's two main categories that exist here. You have the option of a cloud-based limbs, which is accessible outside of the lab and can generally be accessed through a browser. And you also have the desktop application, which would be only accessible on the instrument in the lab. And so a lot of times there's some give and take on what's the better option here. And so my recommendation is to look for, if you're going to need a desktop connection, look for a limbs that can provide both options to you. That'll give you a better way to access the system, but it will also provide you with the flexibility to have those on-premise connections to your instruments, which will allow you to get the data more easily. And so on that note of data integration, I wanted to talk about how to integrate our instruments with our data management. And so this can be done in three primary ways. So most of the time integrations are assuming that you're going the route of a limbs provider, but this could also be for the homemade limbs option. But the idea is that we have three levels of complexity when it comes to getting information from one place to another. The first is parsing a file. So this means that we're going to have a script that reads through a file and looks for certain data elements and will extract them. So you could feed a CSV file into a parser and it'll pull out, you know, your concentration or your pass-fail value or whatever it is that's in that uploaded file. And that's going to be our most straightforward method. It's going to require a manual upload of the file. So a user will have to take that file and drop it into whatever system is sort of the waiting bin for that parsing. The next option that's a little bit more automated is our API communication. So this goes back to the idea of having a flexible API, but if you have that freedom, you can set up a payload that essentially gets delivered to your data management system and will then cause that to kick off a file parser essentially and pull out the necessary data from your payload. So that removes that step of having to upload the file manually and can carry data over from your instrument. And then the last option is a direct integration. And so this is going to be for cases where you want to have that instrument plugged directly into your limbs or directly into your data management system. So some examples of this are HL7, TCP IP connections. There's quite a few of them out there, but it's generally common for older instruments that don't have a web-based connection that they can leverage for API communication. And so these are sort of going downwards or going upwards in cost, starting with file parsers being the cheapest option. And that's just because of the level of complexity. So again, you want to think about the cost benefits here of whether the process that you're automating is going to be worthwhile. And I'm actually going to get more into that on my next slide here. So I wanted to talk about integration costs because it's very easy to get caught up in, oh, we want to automate every step so that way we're minimizing any chances for data transcription errors. But it's really important to think about, you know, how much is it costing us to automate this process and how much time is it taking in the lab on a weekly basis? So when you think about it in context of automation, is it really worth it to automate a task in the lab that requires 1 hour of time per week? Or would you rather automate something that takes 10 or more hours per week? And so it's important to engage in that cost benefit analysis whenever you're thinking about integrating information in your system, because it is always going to be a balancing scale to determine if it's really worth it at the end of the day. So that wraps up our hardware and software section of our talk for today. So I just wanted to briefly touch back. We had our discussion about the lab location. Make sure that you're starting that process early. You don't want to have your staff assembled and on the payroll before you even have a brick and mortar for testing. Think about your instruments and the best ones that are going to fit your throughput for the lab, and the ones that are going to fit your needs as well. And then also always keep in mind how you're managing your inventory. There's a lot of stuff to keep track of when you're testing samples in the lab and recording data and gathering those results. On the software side, we talked about our LIMS, how to find the right LIMS solution for you, how to manage your data properly if a LIMS is not necessary, and then how to integrate with that data management so that way you can get your data flowing from one location to another. So our next section here is going to be on workflow and accreditation. So this is broken up, as some of the other sections, into 2 categories. First, we're going to talk about workflow. So as I said previously, this is your day-to-day. What are your uncommon operations, your edge use cases? What can go wrong? And most importantly, thinking about the question of what does my lab do? What does your lab do? So we'll talk about that in a couple of different ways here shortly. And then accreditation, this is going to be a little bit more of a formal discussion on just some recommendations from what I've seen, not for any specific accreditation bodies or certification bodies, but just to provide some useful examples to help you get started, regardless of what industry you're getting into. So we're going to start out here with workflow. So I've put up here just a basic flow chart, but the idea is that when you're thinking about your workflow, you want to think about it as a step-by-step process of how you get from the start of testing to the end of testing. And you can broaden this more to be from the start of when a customer submits their order for testing, or from when you first receive the sample. But the idea is that you want to break this out into steps, so that way you can easily understand what it is that your team is doing. So some useful pointers here is to think about what is the staff doing on a daily basis. Think about the edge use cases, regular maintenance and calibrations as part of that workflow. The more comprehensive you are when looking at your daily operations, the more prepared you'll be if you encounter those edge use cases. You'll have a documented procedure in place. Another useful tip is to start with a diagram. So it can be as simple as just drawing some boxes on a piece of paper. You could put it on a napkin while you're at the bar or something like that. It can be very casual at first, but you'll want to build on that, and you'll use that diagram to help make everyone more familiar with your workflow. And when I say everyone, I mean team members, vendors, anyone that you're going to collaborate with, and it'll just help you organize your thoughts. So that way you can look at branching points and find out, oh, this is where something could go wrong. We could have a rejected sample here, and it'll just give you a better understanding of what you're doing. On our daily operations, so this is just diving a little bit more into the day-to-day. You can think of this as sort of a game plan or strategy that's meant to deal with unusual edge use cases or what can go wrong. So it's always good to start out, what can go wrong at this step of the process, and then think about how you would best deal with those problems. So things like maintenance, calibrations, audits, certification renewals, if you have regular trainings that need to happen either annually or more frequently. You'll want to think about what goes on in the lab on a day-to-day basis and note all the possible points all the possible failure points, and formulate a way to best deal with those issues. It also always helps to have a backup plan and expect the unexpected. So just keep those things in mind as you're looking at your daily operations. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is, what does the lab do? And so obviously we've talked about this in the sense of workflow, and we've looked at this a bunch of different ways, but the main thing that I wanted to focus on with this slide is looking at answering this question in a couple of different ways. So these are going to sort of increase in complexity, but the first is your elevator pitch. So this is a term that I picked up when I was doing a lot of lab talks during my education, because you would need to come up with a way to explain your research in 5 minutes or less, in simple terms that anyone's going to be able to understand. And so I like to use this concept, especially in the field of lab testing, because it's really important to be familiar with your subject matter and be able to break it down into a nice, simple terms for anyone who might not be familiar. This is also really helpful for sort of checking the knowledge level of potential applicants, or helping to get your vendors up to speed on what it is that your company does. The next way to answer this question is with your internal summary. So the way that this is sort of structured is it would be a 10 to 15-minute review of the workflow. So you can think about it as an in-depth dive into that workflow diagram that we had talked about previously, noting all the failure points and making sure that you're being very descriptive of the steps from a high-level perspective. So that way your team is really well familiar with it. So this is good for individuals on the team that need a refresher, or it could just be a good introduction for new hires as they're getting intimately acquainted with the workflow. And our last way to answer the question here is a comprehensive review. So this would be a thoroughly detailed summary of what the lab does, including things like specific instruments, SOP numbers, reference files, things like that. And this is really useful for when you are working really closely with a vendor to set up the lab, or if you have collaborators that are going to be involved with the workflow, because they're going to need that really high level knowledge. So that way they can be aware of, certain terms that you're using and things like that. So being able to answer this question in various different ways will give you a better mastery of what it is that your lab does. And it'll also give you the ability to use these different answers depending on who your audience is. And then one last thing that I wanted to talk about before we move into accreditation is, what is the value of your lab? Now, this can mean things like, what's your valuation? How is your profitability? But it can also be a lot larger of a question. So now that we have a workflow and workflow process, we want to think about the grand scheme of things. And so I always like to start off with some bigger questions about, what does the lab do for the scientific field and for your customers? Is there anything that it's doing, for the greater good of science to help expand knowledge? Are you looking at new cases, things like that? And it's important to be able to answer those questions because it can help you acquire additional funding. So when you're looking at research funding and grants, you can often get additional funding for novel or groundbreaking processes. And so that institutionalized funding is a great way to help your company achieve profitability sooner and maintain its functionality longer. So that way you're able to serve your customers. So it's important to think about how you can sustain your business, how you can be profitable. It's important to manage your team well in these cases and maintain relations with vendors and customers. But it's also important to think about the bigger picture of what does my lab do for the world? And so now that we've talked about that, I wanted to move into accreditation and sort of what it means and whether or not you'll need it. So accredited labs will have a stamp of approval, usually from some sort of governing body or organization, that will endorse the quality of the work that the lab does, showing that you are consistent and that you are providing high fidelity results for your customers. I've put up a couple of logos here just for some of the organizations that I've worked with. Obviously, there's a lot more than the ones listed here, but it's important to think about, if this is something that your lab needs, because it can really improve relations and increase your profitability by giving customers that assurance that you're doing a good job and that you have repeatable high fidelity results. And depending on your field, you might need different certifications. So obviously we have ISO, ASTM, FDA, and metric listed here. There's also CLIA and a number of other different compliances that are required for different labs in different spaces. So it's important to make sure you know if your lab needs or can benefit from accreditation. And then from there, you can figure out what you need as far as the resources and timeline to get that accreditation. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. But one thing that I also wanted to mention now that we've brought up accreditation is the concern of audits. So audits are a very frightening event because they can lead to a lot of bad news for the lab. So one thing to think about, so audits are essentially an unplanned visit from your governing body to ensure that you are still practicing and consistently producing quality results. And so when you have an audit, this can affect your ability to continue with ongoing projects, as you may need to put certain things on hold. It may affect your sample processing for 1 or more days. And it can even lead to fines or penalties if you're violating certain practices or requirements of your accreditation. So it's really important to be thinking about audits and how you're going to deal with them ahead of time. And a really good way to do that is to have an expert on your team, either QA or QC, who's going to be able to help make sure that you're staying compliant or stay consistent with your testing methods. And it's also good to do some fire drills, do some practice audits on making sure the team knows what to do when there's an upcoming audit looming. So I just wanted to touch on that because it can be a bit of a frightening item. But we can go ahead and move on to some accreditation timelines. So I wanted to just mention this because depending on the organization that you're working with, you may have different timelines where it can be anywhere from a couple of weeks to several months to get your accreditation. So you're going to want to know your window and confirm your timeline with your accreditation organization if possible. You're going to want to ask around, reach out to your peers, ask other labs to see what kind of timelines they encountered and what to expect. And we really recommend that you start early. Do some research on what accreditation looks like for your lab and really get a start on that process as early as you can, because it can be very involved. And so with that in mind, I did want to mention an accreditation example that I came into contact with. So Metric is an organization that provides accreditation for cannabis labs. And in Oklahoma, there is a little bit of a disparity when you have a difference between a medical use license or an adult use commercial license. So if you're going for Metric certification with a medical license, then it can be up to 14 days. So at tops, probably about 2 weeks to get that certification. But for commercial use, it actually goes all the way up to 90 days. And so you could be in a difference of 2 weeks to 3 months if you're not sure which you're required to have. So it's really important to know what approval you need and know your timelines as well. So make sure you know which license is correct for you. And if you do have a case where things go wrong, if your application is denied, if you fail inspection, or if you miss a deadline, you can always reapply. There might be some requirements or some timelines for that, but always be aware that you can appeal if there is any sort of failed certification or inspection, and there are ways to come back from that bad stamp. So that sort of covers off on accreditation and workflow. So I just wanted to restate, be familiar with your workflow process and account for those unusual edge use cases. It'll help you be prepared when things go wrong. And the same is true for accreditation. You're going to want to know your certifications ahead of time, and you're going to want to know the timelines related to them. And it also helps to have in-house experts that are going to be able to provide you advice on what to do when things go wrong. So I wanted to wrap up just by restating some key ideas here. So for your personnel, it's really important that you're starting, or that you're getting the right team built around your lab and that you have a good location. It's also important to make sure that your hardware and software are lined up, that you have the correct instruments that you need for your workflow, and that you have a good way to manage your data. And finally, know your workflow and accreditation. Know it inside and out, forward and back, and it's going to make things a lot easier just to have that familiarity. So I just wanted to close things out with why does it matter? So it matters because these things that I've gone over have an effect on your timeline for getting your lab up and running. That means that the faster you get your lab up and running, the faster you get your time to value out of your various instruments and software. And so it's really important to think about that timeline and making sure that you're staying on pace to hit that time to value, so that way you're not losing money for selecting the tools that you have. You also want to think about profitability, because the sooner we get that time to value, the sooner we can hit profitability, and that's going to allow us to expand the team, grow the company, and onboard additional workflows or additional testing methods. And then lastly, just using this information best would be to follow up and look at the options that are available for your field. If you're planning on imminently opening a lab, go out and start looking at what sort of instruments or what sort of locations are available to you. Start looking at what type of ideal new hire profiles you want to have for your team. So it's important to remember these details, but know that they're not specific to any one industry. These are just general recommendations that will help you get your lab set up quicker and more efficiently. So with that, I just wanted to thank everyone for their time today, and open the floor up for questions.